June 28, 1981, Rome, Italy. The clouds hovered low over the city of Rome. Silver ribbons of lightning touched the rooftops of the buildings that densely surrounded the Colosseum. Children began their count as the storm moved closer. Violent plumes of vibrating thunder shook their homes and rattled their cupboards and dishes. The fierce storm interrupted the silent flow at the Palace of Holy Office. A cloaked figure dodged the lightning strikes that seemed to focus on Vatican Square. This mysterious figure evasively danced with the lightning that followed its every move. The cloaked, soulless mass held something close, as if protecting it. An accurate hit of lightning blew the enigmatic cloak up and twirled it like a fanatical wave, setting the hem on fire. With one powerful hand the dark figure grabbed the fiery cape and whipped it to and fro, snuffing out the flames while it moved briskly towards the Holy Office. Under the protection of the eaves topping the large wood door, the dark figure raised its hand, long and narrow fingers fisted. It knocked 3 times, creating a vibration with every bang, which methodically stroked down inside each hallway, shaking everything in its path. The cloaked form placed the small, tightly wrapped bundle at the base of the door. The mass backed away and evaporated into the blackness of the storm. Thus the lightning subsided on Vatican Square. Several priests who heard the knock opened the large door, and as they did a gust of wind blew them off balance and the heavy door crashed into the thickly plastered wall. Priests, bishops and plain-suited men ran to their aid. One of the men pointed to the bundle at the door sill as it began to move. They gasped and stepped back. One priest shouted, "What kind of demon is at our door?" Another priest waved for silence. Marcus Albinus walked slowly toward the moving bundle. Marcus had been an accountant for the Vatican for a dozen years. He was a son of an Italian family, and his wife from a prominent Romanian family. Perspiration beads formed along his thick, black hairline, his strong jaw clenched, and his eyes squinted against the storm. He approached the door sill as the wind suddenly, inexplicably subsided. The priests and Vatican bishops moved cautiously behind Marcus. He poked at the petite wrapped bundle, no larger than a loaf of bread. It responded with a loud yet muffled cry. He bent down slowly and unwrapped the bundle, exposing a small infant's face as it gasped and cried furiously. Marcus smiled and laughed as he cradled the baby close to his chest. The bishops, however, looked at each other as if they all knew the same secret. They gathered inspecting the blanket the infant was sheathed in. The woven material had a metallic sheen and was painted with a variety of symbols and images. A name was embroidered in red, Damascus. Marcus carried the baby inside the palace building as 2 priests wrestled the door from the wall and closed it tightly. Marcus cradled the infant and followed the bishops to the nearby office and inspected him to see if he was harmed. The Pope's own physician was called out into the storm from the warmth of his home to examine the baby boy. He was about 6 weeks of age and completely healthy. The priests shook their heads. Who would do such a thing, and why? Marcus felt a strong connection to the infant and pleaded with the bishops to let him take the baby home to his wife, assuring them the baby would be greatly cared for like their own. The bishops agreed, knowing that Marcus and his wife remained childless in their marriage. Mrs. Albinus fell in love with the infant instantly, feeling that this was a gift from God. No one claimed the infant. They named him Damascus Albinus. Summer 1991. Mrs. Albinus was the first to suspect that her son was not like other children. He had a sort of darkness about him. His eyes held a certain depth of coldness that chilled to her inner soul. She watched Damascus's behavior closely as he grew. She observed his disdain for her, and felt her child was becoming dangerous. Her husband spoiled him lavishly. Mrs. Albinus received a phone call from a priest who had discovered a videotape of the night Damascus was left at the door of the Holy Office. Before it was destroyed, he wanted her to review it. While Damascus was at school, Mrs. Albinus arrived at the Palace of Holy Office building. Her voluptuous figure was stuffed tightly in a designer dress that zipped on the side, and her black thin-heeled shoes squeezed her toes to the point of the shoe. She was used to paying for fashion. She was greeted by one of the priests who were present when they found her son 10 years prior. She'd been in contact with this particular priest concerning her son's mischievous behavior and unkindness. Mrs. Albinus stared at the doorway where her child had been left, hoping to sense any connection, but nothing at all. just a slight shudder running down her spine. The priest held out his hand and spoke Italian, inviting her inside. They walked down a long corridor in silence, until the priest stopped at a private room. Mrs. Albinus noticed how plain it was, with white walls, one framed photo of the Pope, cream metal cabinets 6 tiers high, one plain wood desk and several chairs. The priest grabbed a videotape off the desk and politely asked Mrs. Albinus to sit in the chair that faced a small TV video player. She obliged the priest as he placed the tape in the video player. "I remember your husband finding Damascus back in 1981. He was crying up a storm. He was a beautiful boy. Does he remain distant to you?" "It gets worse every year." The priest sighed and shook his head. "We have missed your husband since he started his own business." "How is he doing?" "Very well." Mrs. Albinus cracked a slight worried smile, feeling very uncomfortable yet curious of what the priest was about to disclose. The elderly priest turned on the small TV set, pushing start on the video player. "I saved this for you. I knew one day you would want to view it. You see, we have surveillance all over the outside of the buildings, and back then it was primitive, but we covered each door for safety. This is the video of the time Damascus was left on our steps." The small set showed a mass of white pixels on the screen. As the priest fiddled with the knobs, the pixels went to a black voided screen, then a form horizontally appeared, capturing the front step of the building in black and white. A few seconds went by before a black-cloaked figure carrying the baby walked stealthily up the steps, placed the baby by the door, and knocked. The cape had emblems on it similar to the appliques on the blanket Damascus was wrapped in. The black cape completely covered him, with a hood hiding any hair or facial features. Mrs. Albinus gasped and threw her hands over her mouth in horror. "What is it?" The priest, alarmed, pressed pause on the video player. She queerly pointed at the hand of the cloaked person. Was it a person at all? The hand was extremely long, abnormally so, with slender fingers that looked like warped twigs. She shook uncontrollably. The priest turned off the TV and assured her that it was an old tape, and this kind of primitive device could distort things. He would have an expert clean up the tape to view it more clearly. He tried to unruffle her nerves with his aloofness and kindness. "Che cos single quoti grave. Sembra così funesto," she said in Italian. "I am sure this is nothing to worry about," the priest said, fumbling for comforting words. He patted her on the shoulder as a signal that their visit was finished. She arose, wiping her tears, and left the building quickly, overwhelmed with the evil demon's hands cradling her son. After Mrs. Albinus left the building, the priest was on the phone to the bishop a floor above him, asking him to come quickly to his office. The bishop entered 10 minutes later, followed by his assistant. "Come look at this, it is the tape of the infant that was left on our stairs back in 1981, Damascus Albinus. Look closely at the cloaked person's hands, and the curious long emblem dangling off the neck." The bishop nodded and watched the tape in silence. His assistant gasped. "Rewind and slow it frame by frame," the bishop said. "Stop!" He held up his large hand and rose intently from his chair, inspecting the long pointed fingers that had been stroking the baby. "Send this tape to the church's videographers and enlarge each frame of this person. We need a closer look." The assistant grabbed the videotape and disappeared out the door. "Why have we waited 10 years to see this? Why was this not examined when the infant was left on the step?" The priest stammered that he'd been more concerned about the welfare of the infant than viewing the tape, but had kept it in the baby's file in case one day the Albinus family would want to view it. The bishop scowled in disapproval. The priest bowed his head and nodded in respect. The tape created a buzz in the Vatican world as somehow word got out. The film was enlarged and cleaned up to view more clearly. Professionals hired by the Pope were brought in to inspect the tape and review the cloaked presence. Mr. Dayton, a French-American, had studied religious sects and the dark side most of his life. He was dedicated to and educated in demonology and cryptology. He was residing in his home in Paris, France when called upon by the Vatican, once again. This request was different. The telegram came from the Pope. The Church paid handsomely for his silence in all matters. Mr. Dayton had worked for the Church on several issues in the last few years, but had never been summoned by the Pope. This heightened his sense of intrigue. After his flight to Rome, He hailed a cab to take him to the Hotel Ziddens Apollo 6, where Dayton had stayed before. Weary and disengaged from his travels, Dayton entered the reception foyer, which hadn't changed since his last visit 4 months ago. Back then he'd examined new scrolls found in the vaulted archives of the church. These scrolls interpreted the onslaught of the last Antichrist by the visionary dreams of an undisclosed prophet. The church held the very essence of the last days. These clandestine scrolls gave the description of the man that was born of Satan. Dayton was also astounded at the terminology of God in those writings. Dayton had translated the scrolls with much difficulty as they were faded on papyrus. The scrolls also told of men that were deemed the most righteous of God to watch Satan's son. To his best determination, the name of God's faithful warriors. He'd been working on some of the script that didn't blend with biblical annotations and beliefs. He was stumped at the passages describing a city of God on earth and it being surrounded by a thick forest where Menad's offspring resided. He couldn't fathom the existence of such a fable. "Good evening, Mr. Dayton, very good to see you again," said a familiar face. He nodded, and graciously accepted his room keys from the plain, nondescript reception woman. Room 101. He fit himself tightly in the extremely small elevator and rode up one floor, too tired to climb the stairs. He grunted as he opened the door to his room. It was smaller than before. Dayton shook his head at the stinginess of the church. The view, on the other hand, was spectacular of Vatican City, only 10 strides away. He was enthralled with the Christian city of old. He had an hour before the limo would pick him up to examine another finding of the church. Dayton took the opportunity to hang out in his favorite spot, the Bernini room. He seated himself at the far table by the wall. "Good evening, sir, it's very nice to have you back." "The usual." Dayton nodded. The waiter quickly disappeared into the kitchen. The aroma of bacon surpassed the kitchen doors and filtered its way through the room. A typical quaint room of white-clothed tables and red satin-covered chairs gave it an ambience of wealth. "Here you are, sir, crepes with your favorite." Dayton smiled as he looked over his crepes stuffed with smoked Italian bacon, asparagus and almonds. Few things in life made him happy, and oddly enough, this dish was one of them. With his final bite, he dabbed the corners of his mouth with the white table napkin. He lifted up his arm to view his Gucci wristwatch. 7 o'clock, time to be picked up by a black limo to an undisclosed place. The church was being unusually secretive this time. The limo drove him to a large plain building. A man in a dark suit waited outside and escorted him into the building. He entered a small, dark room with a large viewing screen. The man handed him a small packet that informed him of the circumstances under which he had been retained by the Pope. Once Dayton had read the information, he waved for the priest to turn on the video. He watched the black and white film. In the side corner of the screen he observed a cloaked figure, hunched over and carrying the infant. The film had been enlarged for greater detail. Pause the video. Dayton rose from his chair to view the caked figure holding the baby close. In the frame he had clear view of the medallion hanging at the bottom of a necklace. Mr. Dayton grabbed his magnifier and held it tightly to inspect the pendant. It appeared to be a mix of possible gold and silver with some sort of jewels around the neck portion. The thick carved medallion was a beehive with a small sword hanging from its base. Stumped, he inspected the strange hands. As he panned past the hooded face, it turned its head and looked up at him. Even though it was still in freeze frame, the entity's face moved. It was atrociously evil. The eyes were soulless and black, filled with venom. The mouth stretched open as if to screech. Small fangs appeared. It was bottomless. Dayton dropped his magnifying glass and almost urinated. The cloaked entity came alive for that moment and looked him right in the eye, plain evil staring back at him. Shaken, he asked the priest to rewind the tape slightly. As he viewed the tape again, the face didn't move. He asked the video to be stopped and left the room immediately. Dayton ran to the restroom down the hall and threw up violently. After a few more violent upheavals, he felt a slight relief. Dayton knew he found him. He had found the child of Satan. The child, now 11, would soon understand his powers, and Menad would begin his visitations to teach the child. He would lift the veil so the child could assume his right of inheritance and attain the keys to his father's kingdom. Dayton left the bathroom stall and was greeted by the bishop in charge of this investigation. Dayton knew him very well from his previous studies of the church's private scrolls. "You have seen him," the bishop said as Dayton splashed his face with cold water. "I saw something. It is him." The bishop, in his mid-50s, with a double chin and slopping dark brown eyes, already knew the truth. "The medallion, I have never seen before connected with evil. A beehive doesn't coexist with anything satanic, but then again it is a Masonic ritual symbol. I would like to inspect the blanket he was wrapped in." Dayton's face was flushed. "I will retrieve it from the Albinus family right away." The bishop left the restroom. Albinus, that name sounded familiar to him from his studies. He wiped his face and looked long and hard in the beveled mirror. His dark wavy hair was in need of a barber's trim. His signature goatee looked good on his slightly rounded face. His brown eyes were bloodshot. He had been searching for this most of his life. Now it was here, right in front of him. Dayton's vomiting reoccurred from the overwhelming feeling. 1 week later. The church had just received the blanket from Mrs. Albinus. Dayton hopped on the next shuttle plane and landed in 2 hours. He was met by a limo to take him to the office building where the blanket would be displayed for evaluation. He was dropped off at the building at the outskirts of Rome in its business section. As he entered through the revolving doors, a nicely dressed Italian man greeted him. He beckoned Dayton to follow him. In the elevator, the man said that another would be examining the blanket with him. Dayton nodded in agreement as they arrived on the 5th floor. The elevator door opened, displaying a nice reception area with Roman pillars framing the long reception desk, brightly lit to expose all corners of the perfectly cleaned marble floor. A woman with a tan leather satchel over her shoulder met them in the reception area. She extended her hand and firmly shook Mr. Dayton's hand. "Mr. Dayton, I am Adrian. I will examine the blanket with you. My expertise is textiles and demonic symbolism." Her dimples fit perfectly with her wide smile, and her hair in a slick, short bob showed off her long lanky neck. They proceeded down the hall to a door with frosted glass insets that made it oddly retro-stylish. Dayton realized that he'd forgotten to iron his shirt under his jacket. He had always been rather disheveled in his dress, but not in front of an attractive woman. In the office, the blanket lay on a rectangular metal table. White gloves were placed on the table for them to use, though the blanket had been manhandled for years. It was no antique. "Shall we get started?" Adrian asked as she placed the gloves on her slender hands. Dayton nodded, and he too put on the white cotton gloves out of respect. He took from his black tote bag a 45-meter camera. He paced around the 4x4 blanket. On one side was a grey metallic material with all the symbols. The other side was a soft red flannel, supposedly the side the baby was wrapped in. They examined the painting and appliques. Mr. Dayton took several photos of each corner which had a beehive appliqued on it, and Damascus stitched in red on all 4 sides. In the center was an applique of a star with one point facing up. Inside the star was some sort of words painted in green. The top part of the blanket, by the name Damascus, had leaves on a vine. The left side, by the same name, had painted half-moons. On the right were suns, and the bottom had daggers framing the name. From each of the 4 corners to the star was a strange written language that both Adrian and Mr. Dayton did not recognize. The beehives had puzzled him. They resembled the necklace on the dark-cloaked person, and the daggers were precisely like the ones that dangled from the medallion. "What does this all mean?" Adrian asked. "The material is a basic metallic and the threads are average. There is nothing in the texture of the materials that help challenge any theory. The beehive, what sort of symbolism is a beehive?" he asked under his breath. "A colony, some workers, a few queens, honeybees. I believe it dates back to the 1700s as a master mason degree symbol." Adrian smiled as she looked up at Dayton. Dayton did not return the eye contact. He added from his scholarly brain, "The hive possibly denotes man's physical body. The honeycomb signified that which is interior to the physical, the astral body. And the honey is symbolical of the spiritual body, which is composed of the choicest nectars and aromas of earthly experience. There is no reference to the bee or the beehive in the New Testaments. The beehive is a symbol steeped in paganism and mystery religions. Although we find bees in the Old Testaments, let's see, I believe it's in Deuteronomy. Dayton rummaged through his black bag and pulled out a plain Bible. He quickly fingered the pages to Deuteronomy 1:44. And the Amorites, which dwelt in the mountain, came out against you, and chased you, as bees do. Dayton continued to flip pages in the Bible. Another passage, Psalms 118:12. He read the scripture aloud. They compassed me about like bees. They are quenched as the fire of thorns, for in the name of the Lord I will destroy them. Dayton immersed himself in deep concentration. The bee in the Old Testament was used to illustrate the pagan people who would fight against Israel. Adrian, the bees in Christianity symbolized immortality of souls and signified the resurrection. The bee sting was associated with Judgment Day. So, why is it here? Unless Dayton paused. This is possibly related to immortality and the resurrection, but whose resurrection? The child's? Adrian, bemused, remained silent. Damascus, a religious place in history, an ancient city in Syria, which stands on the edge of the desert. It became an important place during the Persian supremacy. Later on it was conquered by the Greeks, and afterwards by the Romans. The demise of Damascus is prophesied in 3 different places in the Bible. Isaiah 17 is one of them. If this prophecy is yet future, awaiting fulfillment, it could happen soon. Dayton sighed. He could see how this all intertwined. Any input, Adrian? She shook her head as she inspected the language stitched on the blanket. It was a sort of boxed script. She asked if Mr. Dayton would send her all the photos. After a few hours of inspecting the blanket, they both closed up their satchels and exited. Dayton hailed a cab and disappeared into the eve. Adrian stayed, talking to the priests hanging around outside, to get as much information out of them as possible. Even though Dayton worked for the Catholic Church, he didn't trust them and was skeptical of their hierarchy of leadership. The problem with old religion came from the power of the Catholic Church in the persecution of those righteous followers in the Renaissances, the Spanish Inquisition era. He couldn't believe there were any followers of the Catholic Church after that horrific period in history. He held much disdain for the Church and for most controlled religions by man. He arrived at his hotel and embarked to his room. He immediately sent his film to an all-night photo shop. He called Doug, his colleague in New York, and left information about the blanket for him and his team to research. Shortly after midnight, Dayton took off his glasses and stretched out on the full-size bed. He had forgotten to eat that night. His stomach rumbled. He was too tired to care and fell asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow. His dreams were filled of demons, babies, suns, moons and daggers, entwined with bees swarming around monstrous beehives. He drifted deeper into a dream state when he was a small boy playing ball in his backyard in Buffalo, New York. It was midsummer. His father, a tall, thin man who worked in manual labor jobs, wore grey trousers and a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves, his hair slicked back into a ducktail in the style of the times. His father was born in Buffalo. His mother, French-born, met his father while visiting her aunt in New York. It was love at first sight, and they married 4 months later. His mother left France to live in Buffalo and soon gave birth to a baby boy. They all lived serenely until his 10th birthday. Arguing became the norm every night between his parents, and finally his father left. His mother packed him up and they returned to Paris, France, where he lived the rest of his childhood and into adulthood. He never saw his father again or knew ever happened to him. His mother married a few times, but she never loved those men like she had loved his father. His dreams were interrupted by a ring from the hotel phone. Groggily, he rubbed his eyes and placed on his glasses. It was an incoming call that the photos were ready and could be delivered. Hunger pains stabbed his stomach. He grabbed the menu off the bureau and quickly ordered breakfast, 4 over-easy eggs with a ham slice and a bowl of oatmeal, along with a large glass of fresh squeezed orange juice. While he waited, he dialed Doug. A tired voice answered. "Doug, Dayton here. Mr. Dayton, good morning to you in Rome. Let me grab my notes, give me a second." Dayton heard rustling of papers on the other end of the phone. "My staff and I have been researching the symbolisms on the blanket. Let's begin with the beehive symbol. It has been traced back to Babylon and the Tower of Babel. That's all we have found out so far on that, not sure why it was there. I will research that more." Doug paused. "It said bees were born from the tears of the solar god Ra. In Greek religion the bee was a symbol of the soul and was later identified with the goddess of the harvest. I could speculate that it is symbolic for a specific religion. Next, the sun, which can mean many different things, but in religious jargon it could represent the sun, meaning son of God, or in this case, just the opposite, the son of Satan. Dayton intervened. Good, I like that. Moons are half moons. Check this out. The wedding ritual of the ancient Romans provides a crucial key to understanding their remarkable civilization. The intriguing ceremony represented the starting point of a Roman family. The first Roman wedding was at half moon. It is written in ancient script that the last sun will rise out of the womb of a jackal and bring horror on the lands of man during half moon. Of course, these are all speculations for you to decipher and wean out. The daggers represent death, or taking of life, or to change it up we think it represents a symbolism of priesthoods of the dark side. Now, the leaves on the vines at the top of the blanket, many of my counterparts believe this could go back to Adam and Eve when the serpent beguiled them, and told them they were naked, and they covered themselves in leaves. Some religions and Masonic structures use this symbolism to cover their nakedness in an apron placed over clothing during religious ceremonies in sacred temples. Why not Satan using the same symbol? We have been searching all the symbolic language archives and the language on the blanket looks more alien than man-made, almost technical in its appearance. This will take more time. Well, I think you're on the right track. Contact me in Paris for anything further. Hey Doug, before you go, will you look into the Albinus name and the history of it? Sure, I will contact you soon. Doug ended the conversation. The bellhop arrived with his fresh warm breakfast and he could not wait to dive in. After he was fully satisfied with the eggs and ham, he carried the orange juice over to his notes. Dayton ran out of time and needed to shower before he flew out to Paris.